the truth remains immigration, all are going to pose huge challenges, and several countries around the world may see some potent changes, and students are likely to be affected. It's opportunities as well as challenges. Thank you very much for joining us. Shifting gear to another important aspect that we are looking at. Well, it's not just India that thinks it's absurd to not have India's largest democracy as part of the all-powerful UNSC permanent member seat, despite being acknowledged by leaders across the world as a global power and the voice of the global south. Now, Elon Musk is the latest to flag this. US, Australia, UK, France have earlier supported India's demand to a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, which consists of 5 permanent members. But this has not been expanded since 1965. And India's bid to secure a place at the global high table has faced opposition from China repeatedly. Just 10 days ago, Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar had said that the world does not give things easily and sometimes you have to seize it. Let's listen in.
You know, with each passing year, the feeling in the world is India ko hona chahiye. I can feel that support. You know, like in many cases, you have to continue. You have to persevere. Like, you know, the world does not give things easily and generously. Kabhi lena bhi padta hai. So we'll have to, you know, keep moving on.
Kabhi lena bhi padta hai. Achal Malhotra, former Indian ambassador, and Professor Madhav Nalapat, who's a strategic analyst. Thank you very much for joining us. Ambassador Achal Malhotra, what really stops India? What's the biggest threat? Many would say it's only China that's stopping India's chances at the permanent seat. But what's the way out? What is India really looking at?
No, I think we should look at it in a different perspective. You know, the call for the reform of the UN, and particularly the UN Security Council, has been on the table for many years. And the question is, does UN require reform? And the second question is, if UN is to be reformed and the UN Security Council is to be expanded, does India deserve to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council? The answer to both is yes. Why? You know, the UN system was, you know, when it was constituted, it represents the geopolitical realities of almost 8 decades ago, 80 years ago. Since then, much has changed in the geopolitical scenario. Today, the UN, the way it is, particularly the UN Security Council, it doesn't represent the current contemporary realities. So many countries like India and you know, Brazil and many other countries have emerged as potential, you know, with the potential to represent the rest of the world on this august body. And it's very silly. It's absurd that you know, there is not a single representative from Africa on the UN Security Council, Latin America on the UN Security Council, and a country like India, which deserves in all ways. We pay our contributions regularly.
Right.
We are the second largest country in the world. Soon we might be the largest country in the world. We contribute generously to the UN peacekeeping operations, and we contribute to global, you know, in the debate on all the global issues. So we deserve, but why? Why is this not happening? Because not only China is, of course, would be the last to see us on the UN Security Council. But these 5 countries which are there and which have been given this power to veto, neither of them, you know, for a lip service, they may say, yes, they support India's candidature, but nobody wants to give up the kind of, you know, powers they have been given. For months and years, you know, this was only being talked about. Yes, UN requires reforms. 10 years ago, it was decided to have a text-based discussions, you know, when everybody was putting their suggestions on paper. But see what is happening. At the snail's pace, things are moving. So there's no single factor which is preventing India's. India deserves, the day it is decided, the day a decision is taken to expand UN Security Council, and it will be voted in the UN General Assembly, I can assure you, overwhelming support India will be elected. But then these five major
No, but
powers should be willing to
allow me to come in, Ambassador.
believe.
Allow me to come in and also get the response of Professor. All right, we seem to have some issue with Professor Madhav Nalapat's line, and we'll get back to him as soon as we have him. But Achal Malhotra, let me just come in again. Ambassador, you are saying as soon as it is time. But frankly, geopolitics has changed so much. Strategic relevance has changed so much. Strategic challenges have changed so much. Global roles have changed so much. India's standing has changed so much. The way the world looks at India has changed so much. So if the UNSC is not to be expanded now, when? Isn't that itself the irony of it all?
Definitely, this is the argument in favor of expansion of the UN Security Council or the UN reform, and for that matter, all the UN institutions, all the other institutions of global governance, including IMF, World Bank, is that they are obsolete, they are outdated, they don't represent the contemporary realities. There has been so many changes undergone, and every continent there is at least one country which deserves to be seated on the high table. And in Asia, how long China alone is going to hog the limelight and enjoy the powers it has by virtue of being a veto wielding member? And Japan in East Asia,
All right.
South Africa, other countries, Brazil in Latin America, and Europe is monopolizing. Russia, UK, France, three countries from Europe are sitting in,
Ambassador?
out of five on the UN Security Council. It's ridiculous, but you
Okay.
see, this is such a painfully
Okay.
slow process. And those who
We are
have
being
powers, they don't
joined
want to.
by Professor Madhav Nalapat as well, Ambassador. Let me just get his reactions also. Professor Madhav Nalapat, we were just discussing with Ambassador how geopolitics has changed, strategic challenges have changed, how countries across the world are being viewed with very different lens. India's role has changed. But it's very interesting, and for a large part of India or a generation, they may not be following this very closely. But India was also offered, there were countries that have backed India's uh, uh, India for a permanent seat to the United Nations Security Council in the past. US has backed this. There was even suggestions to reach out to the Soviet Union for that matter. But would we know the circumstances in which Nehru seemed to have rejected this?
Well, Nehru basically believed that the Chinese would reciprocate by basically ensuring that India also gets a seat. I wouldn't know the motivations behind that particular refusal, but I think the point is when opportunity comes your way, it's better to take it. Otherwise, it may not come again, and it hasn't come for a very, very long time. Having said that, I'd like to point out that under the Indian presidency, the G20 has become a far more important, if I may say so, grouping than the UNSC. The UNSC is basically divided. It's got Russia and China on one side, the US, France, and Britain on the other among the permanent members. And this is a very deep division, and it's only getting worse. So within the UNSC, frankly, all that goes on is talking. So it's become a talking shop. Whereas what happened under the G20, under the Indian presidency, was actually a lot of effort was put in, especially regarding the global south. The African Union was brought in, and so many other economic and other social reforms were proposed, and many were adopted. So I'd only like to say that the UNSC, without the world's most populous country, without the world's largest democracy, without a country which is the fifth largest economy in the world in dollar terms and third already in PPP terms, well, frankly, it's the UNSC that is that is going to suffer a complete loss of credibility because of this omission, and it has already suffered that loss of credibility.
Right. In fact, Ambassador, very important points being made by Professor here. But Ambassador, also, just the point of relevance for something like G20 to have happened, to have given a message of inclusivity, to be able to crack through some very important facts and conclusions that otherwise seem to have been on extremely divisive platforms where countries were not being able to see eye to eye, and to have negotiated that and be able to come out with one common proposal and agenda itself was massive. Just shows how obsolete the entire concept of UN and UNSC has become in a very fast changing pace. Or is that too extreme to be said?
Well, what Professor Nalapat has said, he's made a very valid point. There's a lot of merit about what he says. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, the only organization which is global, which represents all 150 countries, remains the United Nations. So either we give it up and try and replace it by a number of multilateral organizations like G20, or we reform it. So that's the debate which is going on. I hope I made my point. I mean,
Professor
G20
Nalapat,
cannot,
just
at the
a
moment,
very...
it cannot
Yes,
replace.
yes, you have. Absolutely.
Yeah. So it can't replace.
No,
There
certainly.
are so many
A very important
multilateral
point.
organizations. There's a BRICS, which was 5, now it has become 11. ASEAN is there. So ultimately, the world will be divided into so many multilateral organizations. And maybe in some way they will be useful. Some would die, like SARC is becoming redundant. But as of today, we have United Nations, which is most representative. All the 200 members, all the 200 countries in this world are members of the United Nations. So better to reform it. I think that approach is what is needed. G20 can, it's functioning. It will deliver. The BRICS will deliver in its own way.
Okay.
BRICS
Let me
may
just get in the
tomorrow come out with its own
last
currency.
statement from Professor Madhav Nalapat as well. Professor Nalapat, that's just the last minute to you. With the changing geostrategic interests, you've had several countries, including France, also back India's demand for a prominent seat. Ambassadors of the opinion these are just lip services, because if they come down to really doing it, it would have happened till now. How do you really look at this?
Well, look, if we say that we want a vote on this in the UNGA and the UNSC, let's see. I'm quite certain that India will get massive support in the UNGA, and the UNSC, only one permanent member will veto it, and that's China. And let the Chinese be exposed. Let's basically, work hard at getting that. The United Nations is great if it were a United Nations, but today it's a disunited nations. It's a completely dysfunctional Security Council. And my point was that G20 under the Indian presidency was a far more significant group than the UNSC, which was permanently deadlocked. And all that happened was countries abusing each other. It could have happened in the G20 as well.
Right.
But as has correctly been pointed out by the ambassador also, and by you, Sneha, the reality is India was able to bridge these divides. And this is one more reason why it's totally absurd to keep India out of UNSC. But let's expose the countries that are opposed to India. Let there be a vote. We are a democracy.
Right.
We believe in voting. Let's put the issue of Indian membership up to vote. As for Japan and for other countries, well, they can also put their case up to vote. So let's put the Indian case up to vote. And so let's have a look and see who our real friends are and who are not. I think that will be a very valuable. Otherwise, the talk of reform in terms of getting a consensus, it's not going to happen, very frankly, for a very long time to come. So we'll have to be extremely patient, maybe for the next 75 years.
Oh, that's a very long time, sir. That's a long time. I do believe, and I do expect, and India would expect for that matter, there would be something that would come up much before that. In fact, has to come in real soon if the United Nations as such has to be something very relevant to a fast changing, fast evolving, and a hugely different dynamics that is emerging across the globe. Thank you very much, Ambassador Malhotra, as well as Professor Nalapat, for joining us.